In 1958, deep in the forests of Northern California, a construction worker arrived at his job site and discovered something strange near his equipment. Footprints. But these weren't human tracks. They were enormous. The discovery would help give birth to a name that would become synonymous with one of the world's greatest unexplained mysteries. Bigfoot, a massive, bipedal, primate-like creature said to inhabit the remote places where civilization ends and wilderness takes over. But the stories didn't remain in Northern California. Reports began emerging from across the United States and beyond. Similar creatures have been described in distant parts of the world, including Australia. Different names, different landscapes. Yet, the encounters often share unsettling similarities. Witnesses describe an overpowering stench drifting through the trees, branches breaking where nothing can be seen, footsteps pacing them from somewhere beyond the light, and perhaps most disturbing of all, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. Most reported encounters end without violence. Whatever these creatures may be, they seem content to remain hidden, usually, because according to some accounts, there are exceptions. Individuals that don't retreat from humans, individuals that hunt. And according to the story contained in this file, one creature became so violent, so territorial, and so unpredictable that even others of its own kind learned to avoid it. This is not the story of an ordinary Bigfoot encounter. This is the story of an inbred rogue, a killer. Classified case file 001. Killer Bigfoot. My name is... No, scratch that. Names have a way of ending up in reports. Reports have a way of disappearing, and people who ask the wrong questions sometimes disappear with them. So let's say I'm the guy who found the files, not leaked documents, not conspiracy theories copied from some forgotten corner of the internet. Government files, reports, photographs, witness statements, autopsy summaries, trail camera footage. Entire investigations stamped, classified, and buried so deeply that someone clearly believed they would never see daylight again. What I read inside those files could shut down national parks. It could force certain three-letter agencies to answer questions they've spent decades avoiding. Because if even half of what's documented in these files is true, then they know what's living out there. And worse, they know what it has done. The first file I'm going to share begins in Louisiana. August 1st, 2017. New Orleans was suffocating beneath another brutal summer. Even after sunset, the heat clung to the city while insects screamed from the darkness beyond the streetlights. That summer, a young married couple moved into a historic home overlooking the bayou. Their real names have been removed from the file, so we'll call them Mr. and Mrs. Smith. Both were in their 30s. Mr. Smith was an attorney with a prominent New Orleans law firm. He and his wife had met in college, married shortly afterward, and spent years building the kind of life they had once only talked about. And there was one dream they shared: a historic Southern home, old wood, tall windows, a wide porch, and beyond the backyard, an uninterrupted view of the Louisiana bayou. When they finally found it, they thought they had discovered their forever home. The house was beautiful, the property was secluded, and the bayou stretched behind it for miles. Mrs. Smith was 6 months pregnant with their first child and couldn't have been happier. She had already begun decorating the nursery, imagining the day they would finally bring their baby home. For the Smiths, it was paradise. But they would soon discover that paradise is just a word, a pretty word used to describe a pretty, temporary situation. One evening, they sat together on the porch, talking about their day and making plans for the future, their careers, their home, their child, maybe even the children who would come afterward. Then a deafening roar erupted somewhere deep in the swamp. The conversation stopped. Seconds later came the violent sound of water thrashing in the darkness. Something was moving out there, something large. From where they sat, it almost sounded as though two animals were fighting. Mr. and Mrs. Smith didn't investigate. They went inside. They locked the doors. They checked the windows, and they stayed there for the rest of the night. At the time, they had no reason to believe the sound had anything to do with them. They would learn differently soon enough. The next morning, Mr. Smith decided to investigate. In the daylight, the events of the previous night didn't seem nearly as threatening. The bayou was alive again with birds, insects, and the familiar sounds of the Louisiana wetlands. Still, that roar bothered him. While Mrs. Smith made breakfast, he walked the perimeter of their property, searching for anything that might explain what they had heard. Tracks, broken branches, blood, anything. He found nothing. The ground along the property line looked undisturbed. Nothing appeared damaged or out of place. After nearly half an hour, Mr. Smith returned to the house. Whatever had happened out there, he convinced himself, had happened somewhere deeper in the bayou. Besides, they had plans. It was Saturday, and the crib they had ordered was finally ready for pickup. Mrs. Smith had been talking about it all week. At 6 months pregnant, decorating the nursery had become her favorite project, and today they were finally going to put its centerpiece together. The strange noises from the night before were quickly forgotten, at least for a while. They had barely made it out of the neighborhood when Mr. Smith noticed several vehicles stopped along the road. Ahead of them, a small crowd had gathered near the marsh. Yellow tape stretched between two trees. Mr. Smith slowed the car. Mrs. Smith leaned forward in her seat. What happened? I don't know. Being both a curious homeowner and an attorney accustomed to asking questions, Mr. Smith pulled over. I'll be right back. He approached the crowd. Then he saw what everyone was staring at. An enormous alligator lay partially in the marsh. Dead? Someone in the crowd said wildlife officials estimated it at nearly 15 feet long. But its size wasn't what disturbed Mr. Smith. It was the condition of the body. The alligator's jaws had been violently forced apart. Sections of its body were missing, and deep wounds covered what remained. Mr. Smith stared at it. Around him, neighbors quietly traded theories. Another gator could have done it, someone said. An older man standing near the tape shook his head. Not like that. Nobody seemed certain what had happened. Mr. Smith looked toward the dark water beyond the carcass. What could do that to a gator? No one answered. Then the memory returned. The roar, the crashing vegetation, the violent sound of something thrashing through the water. He and his wife had sat safely on their porch and dismissed it as mating alligators. Standing there now, Mr. Smith realized they'd been partly right. There had been an alligator in that water, but it hadn't been making all that noise by itself. Something else had been out there with it. Something capable of attacking one of the largest predators in the Louisiana wetlands. Something strong enough to kill it. Mr. Smith returned to the car. Mrs. Smith immediately noticed the expression on his face. What was it? He fastened his seatbelt and started the engine. Dead alligator. She waited. Mr. Smith pulled back onto the road. Big one. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, Mrs. Smith placed a hand over her stomach. Last night. Mr. Smith glanced at her. He didn't answer. They continued on to pick up the crib. By that afternoon, their home was filled with the sounds of cardboard being torn open, wooden pieces being fitted together, and Mr. Smith quietly questioning why a baby crib required what seemed like an engineering degree to assemble. Mrs. Smith laughed at him. For a few hours, the dead alligator was forgotten. Eventually, the crib stood completed against the nursery wall. Mrs. Smith stepped back and smiled. Their child's room was finally beginning to look real. Mrs. Smith lowered herself into the rocking chair beside the newly assembled crib. The chair faced the nursery window, giving her a perfect view of the backyard and the bayou beyond it. Mr. Smith stood in the doorway and watched his wife gently rock back and forth, one hand resting on her stomach. For a moment, he simply looked at her. His wife, their unborn child, their new home. Everything he'd ever wanted seemed to be right there in that room. Then, Mrs. Smith stopped rocking. Her expression changed. "Do you smell that?" Mr. Smith did. The odor seemed to roll into the room all at once. Rotten eggs, spoiled meat, feces, all of it mixed into a stench so powerful that Mrs. Smith covered her mouth and gagged. "Oh, God!" She struggled to get out of the chair. Mr. Smith immediately rushed toward her. "Come on, let's get you out of here." As he reached for his wife, something outside the nursery window caught his attention. Movement. More than 100 yards away, near the edge of the bayou, something passed between the trees. Fast. So fast that by the time Mr. Smith turned his head, it was gone. He stared through the glass. Nothing. Just trees, brush, shadow. Probably the wind, he told himself. Then his eyes settled on a branch hanging just outside the window. It wasn't moving. Neither were the leaves. Mr. Smith stared toward the distant tree line for another few seconds. Whatever he had seen, if he'd seen anything at all, was gone. Mrs. Smith gagged again. That snapped him out of it. He helped her into their bedroom, opened the air conditioning vents, and brought her a cup of crushed ice. Within several minutes, the nausea began to pass. Mr. Smith stayed beside her until she felt better. He never mentioned what he'd seen outside the nursery window. Not yet. Instead, he walked quietly through the house. He checked the front door. Locked. The back door. Locked. Then every window. One by one. When he finished, he returned to the bedroom and looked at his pregnant wife. The dead alligator came back to him. Then the roar. Then the smell. And finally, whatever had moved between those trees. Mr. Smith didn't know what was living beyond his property. He didn't know if the events of the past 24 hours were connected. But standing there, looking at the woman carrying his first child, he made a decision. Tomorrow, he was going to buy something to protect his family. Monday morning, Mr. Smith found himself standing inside Brothers Firearms in Metairie. He knew exactly what he wanted. A 12-gauge pump-action shotgun, a .357 revolver, and ammunition for both. The money wasn't the problem. The problem was explaining the purchase to his wife. During the drive home, Mr. Smith rehearsed the conversation several times in his head. He would tell her about the dead alligator, the smell that had rolled across their property, the movement he'd glimpsed beyond the nursery window. Individually, each incident could probably be explained. Together, they were becoming harder to ignore. He hoped she would understand. But if she didn't, this was one argument he was prepared to have. He wasn't willing to gamble with his family's safety. As it turned out, there would be no argument. The moment Mr. Smith opened the front door, his wife rushed toward him. "Get inside." He stopped. "What happened?" "Just get inside and close the door." Something in her voice, made him obey without another question. Mr. Smith stepped inside and locked the door behind him. Mrs. Smith was visibly shaken. Her breathing was quick, and she repeatedly glanced toward the back of the house. What happened? It was out there. What was? I don't know. The answer came too quickly. Her words stumbled over one another as she struggled to explain what she'd seen. Slow down, Mr. Smith said. Tell me exactly what happened. He wasn't dismissing her. He was frightened because his wife wasn't the nervous type. Mrs. Smith had grown up in a military family. She'd been taught from an early age to remain calm during stressful situations, and that discipline had followed her into adulthood. Even throughout her pregnancy, her doctors had commented on how calmly and rationally she'd handled everything. Seeing her like this was enough to make the hair on the back of his neck rise. After several seconds, Mrs. Smith collected herself. Mr. Smith began asking questions. Where did you see it? She pointed toward the backyard. Near the tree line. How far? I don't know. Maybe 100 yards. What did it look like? She hesitated. I thought it was a tree stump. A stump? It was dark. Big. It was crouched down near the trees. I wasn't really paying attention to it at first. Mr. Smith's eyes drifted toward the rear windows. What made you notice it? It moved. He looked back at her. What do you mean moved? It shifted. That's when I realized I wasn't looking at a tree. Was it an animal? I don't know. 4 legs? She shook her head. No. Mr. Smith stared at her. Was it standing? Not at first. A silence settled between them. Then what happened? Mrs. Smith looked directly into her husband's eyes. It stood up. Mr. Smith said nothing. How tall? I don't know. I couldn't tell from that distance. Did you see its face? No. Did it come toward the house? No. I didn't wait around to find out. I came inside and locked the door. That answer actually reassured him. She hadn't followed it. She hadn't gone outside to investigate. She had done exactly what she should have done. Mrs. Smith looked toward the windows again. We need to get a gun. For several seconds, Mr. Smith stared at her. Then he slowly looked down at the bags he'd placed beside the front door. Mrs. Smith followed his eyes. What did you buy? A shotgun. He paused. And a revolver. Under any other circumstances, he imagined that sentence might have started an argument. Instead, his wife exhaled. Good. A month passed without incident. Slowly, the Smiths began settling into their new life. They got to know the neighborhood and became friendly with several of the families living nearby. Mrs. Smith was well into her second trimester now, and for the first time since moving into the house, things finally seemed normal. One Saturday afternoon, the Smiths were outside talking with a few of their neighbors. There was laughter, cold drinks, and the kind of easy conversation that came when strangers finally started becoming friends. Then, one of the neighbors mentioned something strange. You know what's crazy? I found these huge footprints behind my property a couple days after they found that dead gator. Mr. Smith's smile faded slightly. Footprints? Yeah, biggest damn tracks I've ever seen. Another neighbor laughed. Probably a bear. That's what I thought, until I got a good look at them. The man shook his head. They were 24 inches long and only had 4 toes. That got everyone's attention. 4. And that's the weird part. They looked almost like a human footprint. Heel, arch, toes, everything, just huge. Someone chuckled nervously. So, you got Bigfoot living behind your house? The neighbor didn't laugh. I'm serious. Who the hell walks barefoot through these woods? And even if somebody did, nobody has a 2-foot long foot. He paused and took a sip of his drink. And you should have seen how deep those tracks were. Ground wasn't even that soft. Whatever made them had some serious weight behind it. How much weight? Mr. Smith asked. The neighbor shrugged. I don't know. 800 pounds? Maybe more. Mr. Smith stopped smiling. Mrs. Smith was staring at the neighbor now. How many footprints did you find? She asked. There must have been 20 or 30 of them. Came out of the woods behind my property, crossed the backyard, then followed the tree line. Mr. Smith felt something tighten in his stomach. Where'd they go? The man turned and pointed toward the road. All the way to the highway. The conversation continued around them, somebody making another joke about Bigfoot, but Mr. and Mrs. Smith weren't laughing anymore. They looked at each other. Neither said a word. They didn't have to. They both remembered the smell. Rotten eggs, spoiled meat, feces. And Mrs. Smith remembered something else. The enormous crouched figure she'd mistaken for a tree stump until it moved. Whatever had been out there hadn't disappeared. It had simply moved on. At least, that was what Mr. Smith wanted to believe. 2 nights later, the neighborhood woke to flashing red and blue lights. The same neighbor who had laughed and talked with the Smiths only days earlier was dead. His body was found shortly after sunrise, nearly 100 yards inside the woods behind his property. Whatever killed him hadn't caught him outside. It had come into his home and taken him. The back of the house was destroyed. The rear door had been ripped completely from its frame, along with most of the wall surrounding it. Wood, insulation, drywall, and pieces of siding were scattered across the backyard. Inside, the house had been ransacked. Furniture was overturned. Cabinets had been torn open. A refrigerator had been knocked onto its side. Deep scratches gouged the walls and hardwood floors, but nothing appeared to have been stolen. The destruction didn't look random. It looked angry. When they found the body, his eyes and tongue had been removed, and his spine had been ripped from his body. A trail through the grass showed investigators exactly where he had been dragged from the shattered house and into the woods. At first, police suspected an animal attack. That explanation lasted until they checked the surveillance cameras. The neighbor had several cameras mounted around his property. Most had gone dark during the attack, but one camera positioned near the rear corner of the house had captured several seconds of footage. The recording was grainy, dark, but what appeared on it wasn't a bear. At 2:17 in the morning, a massive figure emerged from the tree line and approached the rear of the house. The camera couldn't capture its full height, as something enormous moved past the lens. Then a hand came into view. 3 long clawed fingers wrapped around the edge of the rear wall before the siding buckled. Then the entire section of wall jerked outward as if it were made of cardboard. The camera shook violently. For several seconds, there was nothing but darkness, crashing sounds, and distorted audio. Then the figure appeared again. It was heading back toward the woods. Behind it, something dragged across the ground. The neighbor. One of the investigators replayed the footage several times. Nobody in the room had an explanation for what they were seeing. By that afternoon, police had surrounded the property with crime scene tape, and rumors were already spreading through the neighborhood. Standing across the street from what remained of his neighbor's home, Mr. Smith felt something he couldn't explain. Dread. Not fear exactly. Something deeper. A feeling that what had happened across the street wasn't over. And somehow, he knew his family was next. That evening, he finally said what had been on his mind all day. "We should sell the house." Mrs. Smith looked at him. "What?" "I'm serious. Put it back on the market. Take whatever we can get and leave. We just moved here. I know. We've barely unpacked everything. I know. And I'm pregnant. I know that too. She stared at him. Then what are you saying? We just pick up and leave because something attacked a man in the woods? It didn't attack him in the woods. Mr. Smith's voice became quieter. It broke into his house and dragged him into the woods. That silenced her. He looked toward the back of their home. Whatever did that was strong enough to rip a wall apart. Mrs. Smith folded her arms. And where are we supposed to go? I don't care. A hotel. Your mother's. Somewhere. We put everything we had into this house. I know. We can't just walk away. Mr. Smith didn't answer. He understood what she was saying, but he couldn't shake the feeling he'd had while standing outside their neighbor's destroyed home. Something was wrong. Eventually, the conversation ended without a decision. That night, they went to bed. Mrs. Smith fell asleep first. Mr. Smith didn't. The 12-gauge shotgun rested against the nightstand on his side of the bed. The .357 Magnum lay beside the lamp. Every creak of the house caught his attention. Every sound outside made him look toward the window. Sometime after midnight, exhaustion finally won. Then, at approximately 3 o'clock in the morning, the entire house shook. Mr. Smith's eyes snapped open. Boom! The sound was so violent that for a moment, he thought a car had crashed into the house. Mrs. Smith screamed. Before either of them could move, another impact rocked the structure. Boom! Pictures fell from the walls. Glass shattered somewhere downstairs. Then came a third impact. Mr. Smith would later describe it as sounding like a wrecking ball crashing through the side of the house. Wood splintered. Drywall collapsed. Something enormous had just come through the wall. Mr. Smith grabbed the shotgun. Then he heard it. Heavy footsteps downstairs. Not paws. Footsteps. A low growl filled the house. Mr. Smith froze. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The sound was deep enough that he could almost feel it vibrating through the floor beneath his bare feet. Behind him, his wife was trying desperately to remain calm, but her breathing had become short and heavy. Stay in the bedroom, he whispered. She didn't argue. Mr. Smith moved toward the top of the stairs, gripping the 12-gauge tightly in both hands. The hallway was dark. Downstairs, something moved. A shadow passed across the wall. Mr. Smith raised the shotgun. Whatever was down there was enormous. He could hear it breathing now. Then came another growl. Closer. The shadow moved toward the staircase. Mr. Smith exhaled slowly and pressed the stock firmly against his shoulder. One step, then another. The creature reached the bottom of the stairs. For a brief moment, Mr. Smith saw it clearly. He pulled the trigger. Boom! The shotgun blast exploded through the house. Buckshot struck the creature dead center in the chest. It staggered backward, then it roared. Mr. Smith would later tell police that the sound was unlike anything he had ever heard. It wasn't the roar of a bear or the scream of a man. It sounded furious. But underneath the rage was something else. Pain. The creature looked directly at him. Its eyes were blood red. For one terrifying second, Mr. Smith thought it was going to charge up the stairs. Instead, it turned. It ran. Mr. Smith heard enormous footsteps pounding across the downstairs floor. Then another tremendous crash shook the house. The creature didn't bother opening the front door. It went through it. The door, frame, and part of the surrounding wall exploded outward as the creature disappeared into the night. Mr. Smith remained at the top of the stairs with the shotgun aimed into the darkness. He didn't move for several seconds. Then he heard his wife behind him. Is it gone? Mr. Smith stared down the staircase. I don't know. Police arrived minutes later. What Mr. Smith told them would become one of the strangest statements associated with the case. He insisted that he had seen the intruder clearly. It wasn't a man, and it wasn't a bear. He described an enormous bipedal creature covered in dark, matted fur. Its eyes were deep red, and when it stood near the bottom of the staircase, Mr. Smith estimated it was at least 11 feet tall. Then investigators noticed something on the floor. Blood. Dark droplets began near the staircase and continued across the living room toward the destroyed front entrance. Mr. Smith hadn't imagined hitting it. The buckshot had penetrated. The creature had bled, but it hadn't fallen. And somewhere beyond the shattered remains of the Smith's front door, an 11-foot-tall wounded animal had disappeared into the woods. The Smiths moved the next day. They didn't wait for repairs. They didn't wait for another night. They packed what they could, abandoned the rest, and left. Eventually, the family relocated to Savannah, Georgia, where they purchased a newer home in a quiet residential neighborhood. There were no woods directly behind the house, no strange smells, no enormous footprints, no red eyes watching from the darkness. Their child was born soon afterward, healthy. For the first time in months, the Smiths began to feel safe again. Life returned to normal, until one morning, a woman jogging through the neighborhood noticed something strange about the Smith residence. The garage door had been smashed inward. Both family vehicles were still parked in the driveway. She stopped. Something didn't feel right. She called police. What responding officers discovered inside the Smith residence would later be described by one investigator with a single word: a slaughter. The family had been killed. Their bodies had been torn apart with a level of violence investigators struggled to explain. Mr. Smith appeared to have suffered the worst of the attack. One of the first officers inside the residence later gave a statement. I've been a police officer for 20 years. I've worked homicides. I've seen fatal accidents. I've seen things most people couldn't imagine. But I had never seen anything like what was inside that house. I had to step outside because I became physically sick. Investigators initially considered several possibilities: a home invasion, multiple attackers, an escaped exotic animal. Then they searched the yard. Behind the house, investigators discovered a series of footprints. Each measured approximately 24 inches long. Each had 4 toes. They matched the description of the tracks discovered near the Smiths' previous residence. That was when the investigation changed. Representatives from the Georgia Department of Natural Resources were contacted. Local wildlife experts were brought in. According to individuals familiar with the investigation, at least one cryptozoologist was also consulted. Then federal agencies became involved. Within days, the official explanation was released: a bear attack. More specifically, authorities suggested that an unusually large bear had entered the residence and killed the family. There was one problem. Grizzly bears don't live in Georgia, and bears don't leave 24-inch human-like footprints with 4 toes. The explanation didn't end there. The property was eventually purchased. Then, several neighboring properties were acquired as well. Residents were relocated. Access to portions of the surrounding land became restricted, and the Smith case quietly disappeared from public attention. But one question remained: why Savannah? If the creature encountered the Smiths hundreds of miles away, why would it leave its territory to follow them? Researchers who later examined the case proposed a disturbing possibility. The creature wasn't simply territorial. It remembered. Mr. Smith had wounded it. He had fired a 12-gauge shotgun into his chest at close range and survived. Perhaps, to whatever lived in those woods, that wasn't something to forget. The Smiths thought they had escaped when they left their old home. They hadn't. They had only given it something to follow. And if the 24-inch tracks found outside their Savannah home were genuine, then sometime between the first attack and the murder of the Smith family, the creature's territory had expanded. Or perhaps territory had nothing to do with it anymore. Perhaps this time, it came for revenge. Either way, the case was closed. The Smith property, along with several neighboring homes in the surrounding land, was quietly purchased by a government entity. Families were relocated. Access was restricted. Records disappeared beneath layers of paperwork, and eventually, the Smiths became little more than another forgotten tragedy. But the creature didn't disappear. It's still out there. It's being tracked, monitored, and when it wanders too close to civilization, when livestock disappears, when someone goes missing, or when another scene is left looking like what happened to the Smith family, someone comes in afterward and cleans it up. Evidence disappears. Witnesses are given explanations. Reports are rewritten, and another file gets closed. How many times has it happened? I don't know. How many of these things are out there? I'm not sure I want to know. What I do know is that there are people whose entire job is making sure you never find out. Like I said before, if the world knew what was really living in those woods, our national parks and hiking trails would be empty by morning. Case one file closed. There are more files, a lot more. And believe me, some of them make this case look almost normal. If you enjoyed Case File 001, hit the like button and subscribe to Obsidian Quill Publishing Nightmares for more stories from the files they never wanted open. Turn on your notifications because another case will be declassified soon. Another location, another witness, another thing we're told doesn't exist. Until the next file is open, stay out of the woods. And if you ever get the feeling something is watching you from between the trees, trust that feeling, because the Smiths learned something far too late. Moving away doesn't always mean you've escaped.